Every discipline, every profession has certain tools of the trade that they use, right? Chemists, they have, I don't know, mass spectrometers, and astronomers have really big telescopes. What about philosophers? What we have, one of the most crucial tools that we have, are arguments. This is how we go about defending a claim that we make, defending a position that we make, and trying to convince other people that we're right. Because this is such a central and important feature of philosophy, we're going to spend an entire module talking about arguments and argumentation and how they work. So let's get started. When you hear the term argument, you often think of something that happens between two people, right, talking at each other, maybe kind of loudly. That is not what we're talking about here. What an argument is fundamentally is a set of claims called premises that are meant to support some other claim called the conclusion. So, right, the premises are at least intended to provide some kind of logical or reasonable support for this claim at the bottom here called a conclusion. And that's the thing that, the person reading or engaging with the argument, that's the thing that they are supposed to take away. That's the thing that they're supposed to believe after reading through the argument. So an argument doesn't really have to be necessarily between two people. It can be spoken, it can be written, and they come in at least two really big kinds of flavors. So let's talk about that right now. The first category, and the one that we're going to spend the most time on, these are called deductive arguments. I've got some examples here on this slide. The key feature of deductive arguments is that the premises are trying to, they might not do this successfully, but they are trying to provide absolutely conclusive support for the conclusion. In other words, a deductive argument is set up so that if it's a good one, that the premises will guarantee the truth of the conclusion. There's no logically possible way that the conclusion could be false. So some of the examples here, right? All cats are mammals and all mammals have hair, so all cats would just have to have hair. There's no way for that conclusion to be false. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, they are meant to give probable support for the conclusion. They are meant to make the conclusion more likely than not. And at least the good ones will be successful in doing that. We in philosophy, we tend to have a lot more to do with deductive arguments rather than inductive arguments. And so we'll spend a lot more time on deductive ones, although we will come across a couple of inductive arguments throughout the course. But most of what this module is going to be focused on are deductive arguments and how they work. So let's talk a little bit more about deductive arguments and how we can go about assessing them. So the first question that we want to ask when we come across a deductive argument is whether or not it is valid. Now, you've probably heard this term before, and you've probably heard it in a context that does not mean what we're talking about here. A lot of times when people say valid, they mean good, right? Oh, that's a valid point. What do they mean? Well, that's a good point you have. Oh, that's a valid criticism. Oh, yeah, that's a good criticism. Valid in this context does not mean good. Valid is a very, very particular definition that only applies to deductive arguments. It does not apply to inductive arguments. And all it means is that they have the right general structure. Valid has nothing to do with whether or not the argument is good. It's this, the babiest step that an argument could barely step over to be on the way to a good argument. So for sure, if we have an argument that's invalid, it's definitely not any good. But just because an argument is valid doesn't mean that it is good. And we've got some examples here. So I've got a valid, clean argument here. All dogs are animals. Fido is a dog, so Fido is an animal. This seems pretty normal, pretty natural. That is going to be a valid argument that's going to be pretty decent. But valid arguments might have premises. Remember, those are the supporting claims. A valid argument might have premises that are false. For example here, right, all unicorns are pink. Sparkle is a unicorn, therefore Sparkle is pink. That is technically a valid argument, but it's just not going to be any good. And just to really, really drive this point home, let me give you an example of an argument that is technically valid, but is absolutely garbage. Today is Monday. Today is not Monday. Therefore, God exists. That argument, technically speaking, is valid. It's not any good. It shouldn't convince anybody that God does or doesn't exist. In fact, I could have put any conclusion that I wanted to there. You know, God exists, applesauce is made out of peaches, whatever. 2 + 2 is 5. All of those conclusions would have been fine, and I still would have had a valid argument. It's not really important that you understand why that argument is valid. What is important is that you understand that valid and good, not the same thing. To call an argument valid just means that it has the right kind of structure. We're going to talk about that kind of structure in the next video. If you want a term for what a good argument is, the term that you want is sound. A sound argument is one that is valid and has true premises. When we've got a sound argument, we are going to have a conclusion that is logically guaranteed to be true. These are going to be pretty rare, pretty hard to come by, right? It's pretty hard to come across an argument that you can't find some kind of objection, some kind of potential problem for a premise, and we'll see lots of that throughout this course. But this is the term that you want to use if you want to say, hey, that's a good argument. The term that we would want to use is sound. That's a sound argument. So valid, that's like the basic hurdle. But remember, valid arguments can have false premises. It's only when we have a sound argument that we've got true premises and the right structure, and so we've got a conclusion that is absolutely guaranteed to be true. Okay, so deductive versus inductive. This is going to be a really important distinction to keep in mind. Again, most of our time, and in fact all the time in this module, is going to be spent just on deductive arguments. We will come across some inductive arguments in this course, and I'll kind of flag when that happens. But all of the time in this module will be spent on deductive arguments, and we'll be talking about like how they end up needing to be structured in order to be valid. You'll be able to sort of spot patterns and be able to recognize, hopefully, when an argument is valid and when it isn't. So, but the key difference is that deductive arguments are trying to make the conclusion logically guaranteed, whereas inductive arguments are just trying to make the conclusion probable or more likely true than false. And then once we are talking about deductive arguments, then we can ask whether the argument is valid and whether it is sound. These are the two most important questions that we can ask as philosophers when we are first engaging with an argument. Is this thing valid? And if so, is it sound? And just to kind of clarify something that might have been a little bit unclear, sound arguments, like they must be valid. So if I were to say this argument is invalid, it's sort of like by definition unsound. We kind of don't even ask whether or not it's sound. It's like, oh, that argument is invalid. Okay, we're done with it. We don't need to worry about it anymore. So this is what's going to be the focus for this module, are deductive arguments, and really what we're going to be focused on in the next lecture is talking about how to tell if a deductive argument is valid or invalid. How do we tell if it fits the right structure or form? That's what's coming up next. I'll see you then.